The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as 8-year-old Emma clutched her mother's hand tightly. Today was supposed to be the highlight of their London vacation, but Emma felt nothing but dread in her small stomach. Her stepfather, Marcus, walked beside them with that familiar fake smile he wore whenever other people were around. To everyone else, he looked like the perfect family man, but Emma knew the truth that lived behind closed doors. Emma's mother, Sarah, had married Marcus 2 years ago after Emma's father died in a car accident. At first, Marcus seemed kind and caring, bringing flowers and taking them on nice dinners. But once the wedding rings were exchanged, everything changed. The kind words turned into harsh whispers when neighbors weren't listening. The gentle touches became painful grips that left marks on Emma's arms, hidden carefully under long sleeves. Sarah worked long hours as a nurse at the local hospital, often coming home exhausted and unaware of what happened during her absence. Marcus was clever about his cruelty, always making sure Emma understood that no one would believe her if she told. He would hurt her when Sarah was at work, then act like the loving stepfather when she returned home. Emma had tried to tell her mother once, but Marcus had convinced Sarah that Emma was just struggling to adjust to having a new father figure. As they approached the famous red-uniformed guard standing perfectly still outside the palace gates, Emma noticed how one guard seemed different from the others. While his fellow guards stared straight ahead with stone-like expressions, this particular guard, Sergeant James Morrison, had kind eyes that seemed to actually see the people walking. Emma had read about these guards in her guidebook during the flight to London. She knew they were trained never to move, never to speak, and never to break their ceremonial stance no matter what happened around them. The crowds of tourists pushed and shoved around them, everyone trying to get the perfect photograph with the iconic guards. Marcus gripped Emma's shoulder harder than necessary, his fingers digging into her collarbone as he positioned her for a family photo. Emma winced but didn't cry out, having learned long ago that showing pain in public only made things worse later when they were alone. Sergeant Morrison had been standing guard for over an hour when he noticed the small girl with the haunted eyes. In his 15 years of military service and 5 years as a royal guard, he had developed an instinct for reading people. Something about the child's posture, the way she held herself protectively, and the fear that flickered across her face when the man touched her shoulder sent alarm bells ringing in his mind. Emma looked up at the tall guard and saw something she hadn't seen in a long time, genuine concern in an adult's eyes. Without really thinking about what she was doing, Emma slowly raised her hand and began to make a series of small gestures. She had learned basic sign language at school when they studied different ways people communicate. She spelled out HELP with her fingers, keeping her hand low so Marcus wouldn't notice. The guard's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. James Morrison had learned sign language years ago when his younger brother was born deaf, and he immediately understood the child's desperate message. His heart began to race, but his military training kept his body perfectly still. He couldn't break protocol by moving or speaking, but he also couldn't ignore a child's plea for help. Emma saw the recognition in the guard's eyes and felt a tiny spark of hope for the first time in months. She quickly looked around to make sure Marcus wasn't watching, then signed again, this time spelling SCARED with trembling fingers. The guard's jaw tightened slightly, the only sign of his internal struggle between duty and human compassion. Marcus was busy trying to get the perfect angle for his social media photos, completely oblivious to the silent conversation happening right in front of him. He wanted to show everyone back home what a wonderful family vacation they were having, how happy and normal they all looked together. The irony wasn't lost on Emma, who understood that these photos would become more evidence of Marcus's carefully constructed lie. Sarah stood nearby, checking her phone for messages from the hospital. She had been working extra shifts to pay for this expensive trip, hoping it would help bring their new family closer together. She noticed Emma seemed quieter than usual, but attributed it to travel fatigue and the overwhelming experience of being in a foreign country. As more tourists gathered around them, Emma realized this might be her only chance to communicate with someone who seemed to understand. She looked directly into Sergeant Morrison's eyes and mouthed the words, "Please help me," while touching her arm where the bruises lay hidden beneath her jacket. The guard's training screamed at him to remain motionless, but every fiber of his being as a human wanted to scoop up this frightened child and carry her to safety. The moment stretched between them like an invisible thread of understanding. Emma had taken an enormous risk in trusting this stranger, and now she waited to see if her desperate gamble would pay off, or if she would return to her nightmare with no one in the world knowing the truth about her suffering. Sergeant Morrison's mind raced as he processed what he had just witnessed. The child's silent plea echoed in his thoughts while his body remained frozen in perfect military posture. He had sworn an oath to protect, but right now that oath seemed to have two different meanings pulling him in opposite directions. His duty as a royal guard demanded absolute stillness, yet his duty as a human being screamed for immediate action. Emma watched the guard's face carefully, searching for any sign of what he might do next. She had never felt so vulnerable and exposed, standing there in the middle of hundreds of strangers who had no idea what was happening right in front of them. Marcus finished taking his photos and roughly grabbed Emma's arm to move her to a different position, causing her to stumble slightly. The subtle movement caught Morrison's attention, and he noticed how the man's grip seemed unnecessarily firm, how the child instinctively pulled away before catching herself and submitting to avoid making a scene. These were the small details that most people would miss, but Morrison had been trained to observe everything, to notice threats and unusual behavior even in crowded situations. Sarah finally looked up from her phone and noticed Emma's pale complexion. "Sweetheart, are you feeling all right? You look a bit tired," she said with genuine concern. Emma wanted desperately to tell her mother everything right then and there, but Marcus's warning glare silenced her before she could find her voice. "She's just excited, aren't you, Emma?" Marcus said with that practiced smile, his hand moving to rest on Emma's shoulder in what appeared to be a loving gesture to onlookers. But Emma felt the subtle pressure, the unspoken threat in his touch that reminded her of all the consequences that would follow if she stepped out of line. Morrison watched this interaction with growing alarm. He had seen domestic situations during his military service, and this family dynamic set off every warning signal in his trained mind. The child's body language, the man's controlling behavior, and the mother's apparent obliviousness painted a picture that made his stomach turn. Other tourists continued to pose for pictures, completely unaware of the silent drama unfolding. A group of teenagers laughed loudly as they took selfies, while an elderly couple argued about the best camera settings. The normal chaos of a tourist destination provided perfect cover for the subtle signs of distress that only trained eyes would catch. Emma's desperation grew as she realized their visit to the palace would soon end, and with it, her chance to connect with someone who might help her. She looked around frantically, trying to think of another way to communicate without Marcus noticing. The weight of her secret felt heavier than ever, pressing down on her small shoulders like an invisible boulder. Morrison made a decision that would change everything. While maintaining his rigid posture, he began to move his eyes in a very specific pattern. He looked at Emma, then shifted his gaze to a nearby police officer who was stationed about 50 feet away for crowd control. He repeated this eye movement several times, hoping the intelligent child would understand his message. Emma caught on quickly to what the guard was trying to tell her. Her heart began to pound as she realized he was suggesting she approach the police officer. But how could she do that without Marcus stopping her? How could she explain her situation to a stranger when she had never been able to tell her own mother? The police officer, Constable Williams, was busy directing traffic flow and keeping tourists from getting too close to the palace barriers. He was a friendly man in his 40s who had worked crowd control for over a decade and genuinely enjoyed interacting with visitors to his city. He had no idea that his routine day was about to become anything but ordinary. Marcus started to guide his family toward the next tourist attraction on their planned route, eager to maintain their packed schedule. He had every moment of their trip planned out to maximize their social media content and minimize any opportunities for unexpected situations to arise. Control was everything to Marcus, both at home and on vacation. Emma felt panic rising in her chest as she realized they were about to leave. This might be her only chance to escape, but the risk felt enormous. If she tried to get help and failed, She knew Marcus's anger would be worse than anything she had experienced before. But if she did nothing, she would return home to the same nightmare with no hope of rescue. Morrison watched the family preparing to leave and felt a crushing weight of helplessness. His military training had taught him to follow orders and maintain discipline, but it had also taught him to protect the innocent. He had never felt such a powerful internal conflict between his duty as a soldier and his conscience as a human being. The guard began to do something unprecedented in his 5 years of ceremonial duty. While keeping his body perfectly still, he started to make almost imperceptible facial expressions directed at Emma. He raised his eyebrows slightly, then looked toward the police officer again, then back at Emma with an encouraging nod so small that only someone watching him closely would notice. Emma understood that the guard was trying to give her courage, trying to tell her that she had to be brave and take action herself. The realization both terrified and empowered her. For the first time in 2 years, an adult was treating her like she had the strength to help herself, instead of dismissing her as just a confused child. The moment of truth was approaching fast. Marcus had finished organizing their belongings and was ready to move on to the next location. Emma looked one last time at the kind guard who had seen her distress and acknowledged her pain. She took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether she found freedom or returned to her prison of fear and silence. Emma's hands trembled as she watched Marcus pack away his camera and prepare to lead them to their next destination. The weight of her decision pressed down on her like a physical force. She had seconds to act, and every fiber of her being screamed warnings about what Marcus would do if her plan failed. But Sergeant Morrison's encouraging eyes gave her something she hadn't felt in years: the belief that someone cared about what happened to her. "Mummy, I need to use the bathroom," Emma said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the first word she had spoken since arriving at the palace, and the sound seemed to surprise even herself. Sarah looked around for facilities while Marcus immediately showed his irritation. "We just left the hotel, Emma. You should have gone before we came here," he snapped, his voice carrying that edge of annoyance that Emma knew was a warning sign. "There are public facilities just around the corner," offered a helpful tourist who had overheard. "My daughter used them about 10 minutes ago." Emma seized this unexpected opportunity. "Please, Mummy, I really need to go," she pleaded, adding a slight whine to her voice that she knew would convince her mother, while hopefully seeming normal to Marcus. Morrison watched this unfold with intense focus, realizing the child was creating her own chance to escape. His respect for her courage grew even stronger, and he continued his subtle encouragement through barely noticeable facial expressions and eye movements. Marcus clearly wanted to refuse, but they were surrounded by other families, and he couldn't risk appearing unreasonable in public. His carefully maintained image as a caring stepfather was crucial to his ability to continue his abuse without suspicion. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth disguised as a smile. "But make it quick. We have a schedule to keep." Sarah took Emma's hand and began walking toward the facilities, but Marcus immediately stepped forward. "I'll take her," he said firmly. "You stay here and rest your feet. You've been complaining about your shoes all morning." Emma's heart sank. This was exactly what she had feared would happen. Marcus never let her out of his sight when they were away from home, always finding reasons to maintain control over her movements. She looked desperately back at Sergeant Morrison, who had witnessed this entire exchange. The guard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had seen enough domestic abuse situations to recognize a controlling abuser's tactics. Marcus was ensuring he could monitor Emma's every move, preventing any opportunity for her to seek help or tell anyone about her situation. Morrison knew he had to act, protocol or no protocol. As Marcus began leading Emma away from the crowd, Morrison made the most difficult decision of his military career. He broke his stance for the first time in 5 years of ceremonial duty. The movement was subtle but deliberate. He shifted his weight and turned his head just enough to catch Constable Williams' attention. Williams looked over, surprised to see one of the usually statue-like guards making eye contact with him. Morrison's eyes were intense and urgent, completely different from the blank ceremonial stare Williams was accustomed to seeing. Something was clearly wrong. Morrison then did something that could have cost him his career. He looked pointedly at Marcus and Emma walking away, then back at Williams, then repeated the pattern. He was breaking every rule of his position, but a child's safety mattered more than regulations. Williams was confused at first, but his years of police training kicked in. When a fellow officer, even a ceremonial one, broke protocol to get attention, it usually meant something serious was happening. He began to casually follow Marcus and Emma at a distance, trying to understand what had alarmed the guard. Emma felt Marcus's grip tighten on her arm as they walked away from the crowd. "What was that little performance about?" he hissed quietly, his voice filled with the dangerous anger she knew so well. "Did you think you were being clever, trying to get away from me?" "I really do need the bathroom," Emma whispered, trying to make her voice sound small and innocent. Inside, her mind was racing. She could see Constable Williams following them from the corner of her eye, and she realized the guard had somehow managed to send help despite being unable to move or speak. Marcus dragged her into the small building that housed the public facilities. The area was less crowded here, with only a few tourists coming and going. Emma knew this was probably her last chance to get help before they left the palace grounds entirely. Williams positioned himself near the entrance, pretending to check his radio while actually observing the man and child. Something about their interaction bothered him. The man seemed agitated, and the child appeared frightened rather than simply needing facilities. Inside the building, Marcus cornered Emma near the sinks. "Listen to me very carefully," he said in a low, threatening voice. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but it ends now. When we walk out of here, you're going to smile and act normal, or I promise you'll regret it for a very long time." Emma looked at her reflection in the mirror above the sink and saw a scared little girl who had been carrying an enormous burden for far too long. But she also saw something new in her eyes, a spark of determination that hadn't been there before. The guard had seen her. He had understood her silent plea and had risked his own position to try to help her. She couldn't let his courage be wasted. "I need to wash my hands," she said quietly, turning on the water and letting it run. The sound of running water would mask her voice from any tourists who might pass by outside. Marcus stood blocking the exit, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Hurry up," he snapped. "Your mother will start wondering what's taking so long." Emma looked up at him with eyes that no longer held the same fear they had carried for 2 years. "She should wonder about a lot of things," she said quietly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Williams heard raised voices coming from inside the building and decided to investigate further. As a police officer, he had learned to trust his instincts, and everything about this situation felt wrong. He approached the entrance just as Emma's voice grew clearer and more determined than Marcus had ever heard it before. Emma's newfound courage surprised even herself as she stood facing Marcus in the small bathroom facility. The running water created a barrier of sound, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt like she might have a chance to speak her truth, without fear of being overheard by her unsuspecting mother. "What did you just say to me?" Marcus demanded, his voice dropping to the dangerous whisper Emma knew meant real trouble was coming. His face had turned red, and she could see the veins in his forehead beginning to bulge the way they always did, right before he lost control completely. But something had changed in Emma during those brief moments of connection with Sergeant Morrison. Someone had finally seen her distress and acknowledged her pain. The guard's willingness to risk his career to help her had planted a seed of hope that was rapidly growing into determination. "I said Mummy should wonder about a lot of things," Emma repeated, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Like why I always wear long sleeves even when it's hot. Like why I never want to be alone with you, like why I stopped laughing after you married her." Marcus stepped closer, his hand raised in a threatening gesture that Emma had seen countless times before. But this time, instead of cowering, she did something that shocked them both. She stepped backward toward the door and raised her voice loud enough for anyone outside to hear clearly. "Please don't hit me again," she said loudly, her words carrying through the thin walls of the building. "I promise I won't tell anyone about the bruises you gave me yesterday." Constable Williams heard every word and immediately radioed for backup, while moving swiftly toward the building entrance. His years of training had taught him to recognize the signs of domestic abuse. and this child's desperate plea confirmed all his suspicions. Marcus lunged forward to grab Emma and silence her, but she was ready for him this time. Instead of submitting as she had done hundreds of times before, Emma dodged around him and ran toward the door, screaming at the top of her lungs, "Help me! He hurts me when my mummy isn't home. Please help me!" Her voice echoed off the walls and carried clearly to everyone within 50 feet of the building. Williams burst through the door just as Marcus caught Emma's arm and yanked her backward. The scene that greeted the officer was exactly what he had feared. A grown man roughly handling a terrified child who was desperately trying to escape his grasp. "Sir, I need you to step away from the child immediately," Williams commanded, in his authoritative police voice. His hand moved instinctively to his radio, ready to call for additional officers if the situation escalated further. Marcus immediately switched to his public persona, the charming mask he wore so expertly around. "Strangers. Officer, I'm sorry for the noise. My stepdaughter is just having a bit of a tantrum. She gets upset when she doesn't get her way, you know how children can be." But Emma wasn't going to let him manipulate this situation the way he had manipulated so many others. "No!" she shouted, pulling away from Marcus with strength she didn't know she possessed. "He's lying. He hits me and pinches me and says nobody will believe me because I'm just a kid." Williams positioned himself between Marcus and Emma, his trained eyes quickly assessing the situation. He could see the fear in the child's eyes, the way she instinctively moved away from the man, and the subtle signs of someone who had been living in terror for a long time. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Williams asked Emma gently, kneeling down to her eye level while keeping Marcus in his peripheral vision. "Emma Patterson," she said through tears that were finally flowing freely. "That's my stepfather Marcus, and he hurts me when my mummy Sarah goes to work at the hospital. She doesn't know because he makes sure she's not there when it happens." Marcus's carefully constructed facade began to crumble as more tourists gathered outside, drawn by the commotion. His voice took on a desperate edge as he tried to regain control of the narrative. "She's been having behavioral problems since her father died," he said quickly. "The grief counselor said she might act out and make up stories for attention. My wife and I have been dealing with this for months." But Williams had heard these exact explanations too many times before from actual abusers. The pattern was always the same: discredit the child's testimony by claiming emotional problems, grief, or attention-seeking behavior. Emma looked up at the kind police officer and felt the same recognition she had experienced with Sergeant Morrison. Here was another adult who was actually listening to her, who wasn't immediately dismissing her words as childish imagination or attention-seeking behavior. "He gave me this bruise yesterday," she said, rolling up her sleeve to reveal a dark purple mark in the shape of fingertips on her upper arm. "And this one last week," she continued, showing another fading mark on her wrist. Williams photographed the injuries with his phone while calling for Child Protective Services and additional officers. The evidence was clear and undeniable, and Marcus's elaborate lies were finally beginning to unravel in the face of physical proof. Back at the palace gates, Sergeant Morrison remained at his post, but his eyes were fixed on the commotion near the public facilities. Other guards had noticed his unusual alertness, and his commanding officer was beginning to approach with questions about why Morrison appeared to be monitoring a situation outside his designated area. Sarah, meanwhile, had grown worried about how long Emma and Marcus were taking and began walking toward the facilities herself. She had no idea that her world was about to be turned upside down, that the perfect family life she thought she had been building was actually a carefully constructed prison for her daughter. The truth that Emma had been carrying alone for 2 years was finally spilling out in front of witnesses who believed her. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like someone was going to protect her instead of hurt her. The secret signal she had sent to the Royal Guard had set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. Sarah approached the public facilities with growing concern, wondering what was taking so long and why she could hear raised voices coming from inside the building. As she rounded the corner, she was shocked to find a crowd of tourists gathered around a police officer who was speaking seriously with Emma and Marcus. "What's going on here?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with confusion and worry as she pushed through the small crowd of onlookers. Her first instinct was to protect her family from whatever misunderstanding had occurred. Constable Williams looked up at the woman he assumed was the child's mother. "Ma'am, are you Sarah Patterson?" he asked professionally, though his tone was gentle given the sensitive nature of the situation. "Yes, that's me. I'm Emma's mother," Sarah replied, looking back and forth between the officer, her daughter, and Marcus with growing alarm. "What's happening? Why is everyone staring at us?" Emma felt her heart racing as she realized this was the moment she had dreaded and hoped for simultaneously. Her mother was about to learn the truth that had been hidden for so long. But Emma wasn't sure how Sarah would react. Would she believe her daughter, or would she choose to protect the man she had married? "Mummy," Emma said quietly, her voice trembling with emotion, "I need to tell you something that I should have told you a long time ago, but I was too scared." Williams gently guided the family to a more private area, away from the curious tourists, while backup officers arrived on the scene. He had handled many domestic situations, but cases involving children always required extra care and sensitivity. Marcus made one last desperate attempt to control the situation. "Sarah, honey, don't listen to whatever stories she's been telling. You know how Emma gets when she's tired and overwhelmed. She's just acting out because of all the excitement of being in London." But Sarah was beginning to notice things she had somehow missed before. The way Emma instinctively moved away from Marcus, the fear in her daughter's eyes, and the defensive way Marcus was positioning himself between them. The pieces of a puzzle she hadn't realized existed were starting to fall into place. "Emma, sweetheart, what do you need to tell me?" Sarah asked, kneeling down to her daughter's level just as the police officer had done. For the first time in months, she was giving Emma her complete, undivided attention without distractions from work or household responsibilities. Emma took a shaky breath and rolled up her sleeves, revealing the bruises she had hidden for so long. "Marcus hurts me when you're at work, Mummy. He pinches me and grabs me really hard and tells me that nobody will believe me if I tell because I'm just a kid." Sarah's face went through a series of emotions: shock, disbelief, horror, and finally a mother's protective fury. She had been working so hard to provide for their family that she had missed the signs of her daughter's suffering happening, right under her roof. "He said you loved him more than me and that if I told you, you would choose him and send me away to live with strangers," Emma continued, tears streaming down her face. "I was so scared, Mummy. I didn't know what to do." The weight of her daughter's words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She thought about all the times Emma had seemed withdrawn, all the long sleeves in warm weather, all the occasions when Emma had tried to avoid being alone with Marcus. The signs had been there, but she had been too busy and too trusting to see them. Marcus continued to protest his innocence, but his arguments became increasingly desperate and contradictory. "Sarah, you can't seriously believe this nonsense. I've been nothing but patient with Emma's adjustment issues. This is just her way of getting back at me for trying to provide some discipline and structure." But Sarah was no longer listening to Marcus. Her medical training had taught her to recognize the signs of abuse, and she was horrified to realize she had missed them in her own child. She pulled Emma into a protective embrace while Williams continued documenting the situation and gathering evidence. "I'm so sorry, baby," Sarah whispered into Emma's hair. "I'm so sorry I didn't see what was happening. I'm sorry I didn't protect you. But I believe you now, and I promise he will never hurt you again." Back at the palace gates, Sergeant Morrison was finally approached by his commanding officer, who had noticed his unusual behavior and the commotion he seemed to be monitoring. "Morrison, what's your interest in that situation over there?" the officer asked, following Morrison's gaze toward the crowd gathered near the public facilities. "Sir, I believe I witnessed the beginning of a domestic abuse disclosure," Morrison replied formally, though his voice carried deep emotion. "A child signaled for help using sign language, and I alerted Constable Williams to the situation." His commanding officer raised an eyebrow. "You broke protocol to alert a civilian police officer?" "Yes, sir. I did," Morrison answered without hesitation. "I believed a child was in immediate danger, and my conscience demanded that I act." The commanding officer studied Morrison's face for a long moment. In 15 years of military service, Morrison had never received a single disciplinary action. He was known for his integrity, professionalism, and dedication to duty. If he had broken protocol, there must have been an exceptional reason. "Tell me exactly what you observed," the officer commanded. Morrison described the entire sequence of events. Emma's desperate sign language plea, the controlling behavior he had witnessed from Marcus, and his decision to alert Constable Williams despite the breach of ceremonial protocol. Meanwhile, Child Protective Services had arrived on the scene and were conducting their own assessment. Emma's bruises were photographed as evidence, and trained social workers interviewed her separately from both Sarah and Marcus to ensure she felt safe to tell her complete story. Marcus was becoming increasingly agitated as he realized his carefully constructed world of lies was collapsing around him. The charming facade that had fooled Sarah and their neighbors for 2 years was finally being exposed under the scrutiny of trained professionals who had seen his type of manipulation before. Emma felt a mixture of relief and terror as she told her story to the social workers. Relief that the truth was finally coming out, but terror about what would happen next. Her entire life was about to change, and she wasn't sure what that would mean for her and her mother. The crowd of tourists gradually dispersed as police officers asked them to move along and give the family privacy during this difficult situation. But many of them would remember witnessing something extraordinary. A child finding the courage to speak her truth, and adults who actually listened and believed her. 3 months later, Emma sat in the front row of a small ceremonial hall within the walls of Buckingham Palace, wearing a bright yellow dress that her mother had bought especially for this important day. Her arms were no longer hidden beneath long sleeves, and the bruises that had marked her skin were now just fading memories of a nightmare that was finally over. Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand gently as they waited for the ceremony to begin. The past few months had been challenging as they worked through the trauma and rebuilt their relationship, but they were stronger now than they had ever been. Sarah had taken a leave of absence from work to focus on Emma's healing and had started therapy herself to deal with the guilt of not recognizing the signs of abuse sooner. Marcus was no longer part of their lives. He had been arrested that day at the palace and was currently serving time in prison for child abuse. The evidence against him had been overwhelming, and several neighbors had come forward with their own suspicions once the truth became public. Emma's testimony, combined with the physical evidence and witness statements, had ensured that he would never be able to hurt another child. The ceremony they were attending was unprecedented in the history of the Royal Guard. Sergeant James Morrison was being honored for his actions that day, but not in the way anyone might have expected. Rather than being disciplined for breaking protocol, he was receiving a commendation for courage and humanitarian service. Emma had specifically requested to attend this ceremony and to thank the guard who had seen her silent plea for help and risked his career to ensure she received assistance. She had written him a letter that she planned to read aloud as part of the proceedings, though she was nervous about speaking in front of so many important people. Morrison stood at attention in his dress uniform, still finding it hard to believe that his decision to break centuries of tradition had resulted in commendation rather than court-martial. His commanding officer had spent weeks investigating the incident and interviewing everyone involved before determining that Morrison's actions represented the highest ideals of military service, protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Constable Williams was also being honored that day for his quick response and professional handling of the domestic abuse disclosure. He had become something of a hero in Emma's eyes, the brave police officer who had believed her story and made sure she was safe. The ceremony began with a speech from a high-ranking military official who explained the exceptional circumstances that had led to this unusual recognition. He spoke about the balance between following orders and following conscience, and how true courage sometimes requires making difficult choices in impossible situations. When it was Emma's turn to speak, she walked to the podium with her carefully prepared letter. Her voice was clear and strong as she began to read, a far cry from the frightened whisper she had used for so many months when Marcus controlled her life. "Dear Sergeant Morrison," she began, "I want to thank you for seeing me that day when I felt invisible to the whole world. You couldn't move or speak, but your eyes told me that someone finally understood I was in trouble. You risked getting in big trouble yourself just to help a little girl you didn't even know. The audience listened in complete silence as Emma continued her heartfelt message. I learned that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing even when you are scared. You showed me what real courage looks like, and you helped me find my own courage to tell the truth. Morrison felt tears welling up in his eyes as he listened to this remarkable child who had endured so much yet had found the strength to survive and heal. Her words meant more to him than any military medal or official recognition ever could. Emma folded her letter and looked directly at Morrison. Thank you for breaking the rules to save me. Sometimes breaking the rules is exactly the right thing to do. The ceremony concluded with Morrison receiving his commendation and Emma presenting him with a handmade card that she had created in art therapy. The card featured a drawing of a royal guard with kind eyes and a little girl who was no longer afraid. After the official proceedings ended, Morrison was finally able to speak with Emma and Sarah face to face. He knelt down to Emma's level, just as Constable Williams had done that frightening day 3 months ago. Emma, you are the bravest person I have ever met, he said quietly. What you did that day took more courage than anything I've ever done in 15 years of military service. You saved yourself, and that makes you a hero. Emma smiled shyly and handed him the card she had made. I drew you with a smile because even though you couldn't move your mouth that day, your eyes were smiling at me. That's how I knew you were a good person who would help me. Morrison looked at the drawing and felt overwhelmed by the simple but profound wisdom of this 8-year-old girl who had survived something no child should ever have to endure. The picture showed him exactly as she had seen him that day, not as an intimidating figure of authority, but as someone who cared about her well-being. Sarah stepped forward and shook Morrison's hand firmly. I can never thank you enough for what you did. You gave me my daughter back, and you helped both of us find our way to a better life. Emma talks about you all the time as the guard who taught her that asking for help is brave, not weak. The three of them stood together in the ornate ceremony hall, representatives of a story that had touched everyone who heard it. Emma had learned that her voice mattered and that there were adults in the world who would listen and believe her. Morrison had discovered that sometimes the most important orders come from the heart rather than from a superior officer. And Sarah had learned to truly see her daughter and prioritize her safety above all else. As they prepared to leave the palace, Emma asked if she could visit the spot where everything had changed 3 months ago. They walked together to the famous gates where the red uniformed guards stood at their posts, maintaining their centuries-old tradition of silent vigilance. The current guard on duty was a young soldier who had heard about Morrison's heroic actions and had requested to be stationed at the same post. As Emma approached, she noticed him watching the crowd with the same careful attention that Morrison had shown that day. Emma waved at the new guard and was delighted when he gave her an almost imperceptible wink, maintaining his professional posture while acknowledging her presence. She realized that Morrison had not only saved her, but had also inspired his fellow guards to be more aware of the people around them. The story of Emma's courage and Morrison's compassion had spread throughout the Royal Guard and the London police force, changing how many officers thought about their duty to protect and serve. Training programs were updated to include information about recognizing signs of domestic abuse, and guards were given guidance on how to alert authorities when they witnessed concerning situations during their ceremonial duties. Emma and Sarah walked away from the palace hand in hand, their relationship stronger than it had ever been. They had both learned valuable lessons about trust, communication, and the importance of believing in each other. The nightmare that had dominated their lives for 2 years was finally over, replaced by hope and healing. Morrison returned to his regular duties as a royal guard, but he never forgot the brave little girl who had changed his perspective on what it truly meant to serve and protect. He continued to watch the crowds with extra attention, knowing that behind the smiles and tourist excitement, there might be someone else who needed help but didn't know how to ask for it. The secret signal that Emma had sent that day had created ripples that extended far beyond her own rescue. It had reminded everyone involved that courage comes in many forms. that breaking rules is sometimes necessary to do what's right, and that even the smallest voice deserves to be heard when crying out for help. Emma's story became a testament to the power of human connection and the difference that one person's willingness to act can make in changing another person's entire world.